Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Wednesday, February 5th, 2020. Time for yet another show. It is, last day of the impeachment hearings. And so we can check in on, or not the hearings, but rather the trial. We can check in on what's going on there. Not really much happening, I don't think, trial-wise. I think the votes are scheduled for today. And, of course, I think we all kind of know the outcome of that. But I guess that ends the big show over on the Senate side for the time being. No word in the last couple of days whether there's any indication from anybody, any leadership in the House, of any intention to press forward either with other articles of impeachment or even continued investigations, though lots of people are talking at the very least about continuing with the investigative probes that led to the impeachment. We'll see whether the conduct of the trial and the complaints of the president's counsel during the trial have any effect, if there are investigations going forward, have any effect on how those hearings are conducted and under what auspices. It's interesting. I'm not sure exactly. I guess we'd have to have a meeting and sit down and talk about it to decide whether or not they ought to proceed as they had before, or whether they concede the point, or I guess for the sake of argument, concede the points that the president's counsel made about the conditions under which they issued subpoenas. Although I suppose now, with the articles of impeachment having been reported out, that's an interesting question. If the articles haven't been reported out and tried in the Senate, passed on to the Senate, if you were to issue subpoenas now, and it would be an interesting question whether if you were to issue subpoenas now, would they be considered having been issued under impeachment context, or if you wait until after the vote, does that change anything? I don't know. Well, at any rate, let's see. Lots going on all around. Today there was a State of the Union last night, and from what I can gather from this morning's news, and we'll ask Greg Dworkin exactly what he thinks about all that, whether or not there were other reactions, I'm not sure, but I do see from much of the mainstream press that despite the fact that Daniel Dale, member of the mainstream press himself, found the text of the speech to be full of lies, even the advanced text of the speech. He wasn't even just ad-libbing the lies. It was interesting. He commented beforehand that it's usually the case that the prepared text is, certainly less rife with lies, and that the lies tend to come when Trump embellishes and wanders off script. But this time, in his pregame analysis, Daniel Dale was identifying things that were pre-scripted lies before they even started with the event itself. And I noticed, for example, this morning, let's see, I think I pocketed it. Let's go and check on what's in there. Philip Rucker from the Washington Post, of course, tweeting that he was impressed with the visual story of Trump's reality show reveals during the speech, and there was a new stunt, and I'm sure, I don't know whether you watched the speech or not. You probably saw the clip. During the speech, Trump announces the speech being attended by Rush Limbaugh, one of the most horrible, vile people that we've got in the country, and most responsible for our political polarization along largely false, artificially set fires along the dividing lines of our polarization, largely due to him personally and his style of programming. Honored with the Presidential Medal of Freedom yesterday, but right at the at the speech. It's a very Donald Trump thing to do, I guess. Not only to announce that he would be getting the Presidential Medal of Freedom, but not to hold a separate and distinct ceremony for it, which is fine by me, but to actually do it right there, to stop the State of the Union address and have Melania Trump put this ribbon around his neck in view of everybody and on the television cameras. And then a cheesy old stunt that I really have never loved. The old, look at this poor military family. Dad has been, in many cases it's mom, but of course for the Donald Trump version of it, it will be dad. Been deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan for X number of years or X number of times. And look how sad and forlorn this family is. But they're honored to be here tonight. But guess what? Behind door number 3, Dad's been brought home. How did I possibly manage to do that as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces? It's not that it's difficult to engineer such a thing. It's just, does it have anything to do with the State of the Union? No, it doesn't. But, the war does. But bringing a guy home for a little homecoming party, well, it's nice, and I'm sure he was glad to be there. Yeah. So that was one of those moments where I think it was designed, people commented at the time, to force Democrats to stand and applaud during the State of the Union, which they were otherwise refusing to do, by offering up content that the press would feel comfortable criticizing Democrats for not standing and applauding. How could you not honor our troops? Well, because it was an artificial stunt, and it didn't really stick quite as much. So far as I've seen, as they thought it might. But there's certainly a segment of the traditional media that views the speech as having been a great success because he didn't say anything horrific or flub his lines or wander too far off the script. Occasionally just a few slips of the tongue that he corrected in very Trump-like fashion by repeating the line and adding the word totally or so very or so true, so true. But otherwise, not much of a disaster, and I guess most of the focus is on Pelosi tearing up the text of the speech afterwards. Greg Dworkin is with us with his roundup of news from Iowa. That, by the way, stepped on a lot of the State of the Union news, impeachment, cast a cloud over it. Interesting mix of coverage, I would say.
Yeah, all true.
Yeah, so that's it.
But good morning.
Hey, okay, good morning.
So I'm going to start off with Brent Staples from the New York Times.
All right.
Winner of the 2019 Pulitzer Prize for editorial writing.
Oh.
Who writes, a pathological liar, this is on Twitter, has a huge rhetorical advantage over rivals who are too timid to call lying by its rightful name.
Yes.
So you have the stage. I mean, there's no question about that. It's Trump's stage, and he gets to do these staged things. As most of the political scientists point out, State of the Unions don't have much effect because usually it's, for example, the Republicans that'll be watching Trump, not so much the Democrats. I only watched it on and off. The only parts that I caught that I thought were of significance were the Medal of Freedom given to Rush Limbaugh. And I can't think of a more non-deserving person, as people pointed out online.
Yeah.
Trump has bad things to say about John Lewis and good things to say about Rush Limbaugh, which tells you what you need to know.
Yeah.
But at the very beginning of the speech, he didn't shake Pelosi's hand.
Right.
Pelosi introduced him. She didn't say, it's my great honor and pleasure, whatever the formalized words are.
Yes,
she just said, ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States. So that was notable from the start. So her saying that, him not shaking her hand, that was just like super obvious before we even started. As soon as he opened his mouth, the Republicans started chanting 4 more years. And I thought, oh, God, here we go.
Yeah.
It's a campaign rally and totally inappropriate for that chamber. And then stuff happens and he says stuff and a lot of it's not true and some of it's fascist and some of it's, xenophobic and some of it's, a play for conservative black males. And then, at the end, Pelosi rips up his speech. And that's the thing that struck me. And I forgot the whole rest of the State of the Union. And this morning and all over Twitter, oh, my goodness, how was this appropriate? Was it not appropriate? And, of course, I thought, why don't I just I'm sort of tired of it, so I don't do this that much anymore. Why don't I turn on Morning Joe and see what the villagers are saying?
Okay.
And, Joe says, you know what? Trump's a bully,
Yes.
and Pelosi's the leader of the party. And she has this visual where she clearly meant this to happen. It wasn't just a spontaneous thing. We know that because she held it up for the camera and she ripped it 3 times.
All right.
And it was great. And it worked. And that's a response. And good for her.
Yeah.
And you know what? That was my response too.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, they tried their faux outrage thing. I don't know how many people really bought into it. And of course,
No, it's because it's getting old.
well, yeah.
Adam
And Trump
Schiff
is a
said
big-
heads on a pike. Oh, we're outraged about that. Now we're
Yeah,
outraged about
that's
that.
true.
Now we're
We have-
outraged about, there's like 15 different things to be outraged in the past 4 days, all of which have been shown to be bogus. This isn't working.
Yes.
It only works like every once in a while you do it.
That's that's probably true, and they have overdone it, and that has not helped them any. And of course, I mean, I don't know. I found that particular bit of outrage a little stupid, given that I mean, I don't know. Maybe people didn't notice it as much as I did, but I mean, Trump actually is famous for walking around tearing up papers wherever he goes. He's even eaten a few of them in a few of the press. So I mean,
which is not a great look.
No.
So anyway, that's all I have to say about the State of the Union.
All right, that's
I
enough.
will say,
the
though,
whole union. That's it.
it's in the context of everything else that's happening. The debacle in Iowa, for example,
Stupid
the state of the economy, a outlier Gallup poll showing Trump at his highest level, which, by the way, is still within his range when you look at the aggregates. So if you're looking for a Trump is making a comeback narrative, you can certainly find it. It's not hard. I mean, it's like people are throwing it in your face. Whether it's true or not true remains to be seen. But, if you have a depressed group of Democrats because he's going to skate on impeachment and people like Susan Collins and Lamar Alexander are lying about what they're doing, and if you have the State of the Union looking like a good reality show, and if you look at the Iowa caucuses, which makes the Democrats look terrible, then, this is a good time to make the, oh my goodness, Trump is making a comeback. Of course, there's not a tremendous amount of data for that yet. And so we'll be looking at all of that over the next week and see if it's true. And if it is true, is it a short thing? Is it a long thing? In the end, this bad week doesn't really have an effect on what happens down the road. It just feels terrible. It's like you're a Yankees fan. You just lost the series to the Red Sox, but, the World Series isn't there yet.
Yeah, I guess so. All right. We got a long way to go for that. Do you feel bad about the caucuses? We didn't get a chance to talk to you about how horrible they were. Go ahead.
Well, that's the main thing I'm going to talk
Okay.
about. Do I lament what I hope to be the death of the caucuses? No, I do not.
Oh, well. Jeez.
But interesting things to say about that.
All right.
Okay. One of the more interesting ones I found actually was from the dean of the Iowa political reporters, who's no longer a political reporter, quit the business and is now in academia.
Oh.
And that's a name you haven't heard for a while, David Yepsen.
Academia. Oh, okay.
Right?
Yes.
My hat's off to the dean of Iowa political journalists, says Dave Wasserman. David Yepsen, who presently predicted when we were teaching at University of Chicago politics last spring that the Democrats' new bells and whistles would create results reporting mess. And Yepsen said, yep, sorry, I was right. This is all from the Bundaround via Twitter. Sorry, I was right. RIP caucuses. And after the GOP fiasco of 2012, Iowa probably shouldn't even try.
Okay.
Or Philip Brucker interviewing him. This fiasco means the end of the caucuses is a significant American political event. The rest of the country was already losing patience with Iowa anyway, and this cooks Iowa's goose. Frankly, it should, said Iowa journalism legend David Yepsen. And I'm just using Yepsen, first of all, because he knows Iowa, and secondly, because let's start out with what Iowans are saying rather than, all you non-Iowans don't really get what's going on here, because that's usually what you hear.
Yes.
Where are we at in those caucuses, and how did it fall out, and what interesting things can we get out of this? Firstly, let me just say, I think the people who were hurt most by the fact that Iowa promised us a result in an hour, and it's been 2 days and we don't have the full results yet. Yes. And I think the people who got hurt most are the activists, not the candidates, but the activists who support the candidates, the people who were working their butts off for a year, who were getting, 6-day weeks and 6 hours of sleep every night for a year. And they don't get to get that moment of winning, I guess it steps on the ones who lost. So in that case, it just doesn't feel good for anybody. And so it was a real debacle in that regard. So as of 6 p.m. Tuesday, and as of this morning, this really hasn't changed. What happened is that Bernie Sanders, got most. He slightly led but he got more than anybody else number of votes in the first alignment. And the first alignment, as we know, didn't count. And then when you had your realignment based on those who weren't viable, like Biden or Klobuchar, for example, their caucus goers would move to one of the others. And the one who did best with that was Pete Buttigieg.
Yes.
And I have a piece I gave you, I think, from 538, more results in. It's a preliminary results in the Iowa caucus. It's preliminary because we only have 71% of precincts reporting as of this morning. People were showing photos of the tally card in each individual caucus, which had a lot of scratch outs and crayon written in on top. And there's 1,700 of them to go through. And so because the program that was supposed to do this failed, the way the Obamacare site failed the day it went up, they had to do it by hand. But they were able to do it by hand because they had a paper ballot. It's just that it's a really complicated one, hard to read quickly and verify. So it takes time to go through all of this. And that's why we won't have our results till maybe later today. But let me just read the first alignment, the final alignment, and what's called the thing that counts, the state delegate equivalents.
Yes, all right.
State equivalents are then transferred into delegates. And the total number of delegates for the state is 41, otherwise known as 1% of the entire convention.
And one less than 42.
So there's a tiny amount, because, 42 could have been the answer, but no, it's 41.
It's even less than the answer.
So first alignment, Pete gets 21. Final alignment, 25. And the state delegate equivalent, the SDE, is 27%.
Percent, okay.
And then you translate it to actual delegates, which is going to be about 10. But listen to the numbers. He starts with 21. By final alignment, he gets 25. And then when you finally get around to assigning the delegates, he gets 27%. What I'm saying is the way his ground game was organized is he was able to pick up efficiently things that were available to him. His whole ground game strategy, basically having bright, happy people, trying to get everybody to join their side of the gym.
Sure.
Worked.
Well, that's the
here's Bernie's numbers. First alignment 24, final alignment 26, SDE 25.
Okay, well, what's wrong with that?
So Buttigieg went up from 21 to 25 in final alignment. Sanders went from 24 to 26. So Buttigieg went up 4, Sanders went up 2. And Buttigieg went up even further when it came to the delegates, and Sanders didn't. So on the whole, Buttigieg seems to be doing ever so slightly better for bragging rights, even though it's a virtual tie.
Okay.
Warren, for example, 19 first alignment, final alignment 21, SDE 18. So even though she went up slightly in the final alignment, she actually lost, delegates. Biden, 15, 13, 15. He was pretty efficient. He didn't get very many votes, but he made the most of what he got.
Yeah, I guess so.
Which was, fourth place and a pretty bad showing, but we'll get to that. But he was very efficient in terms of picking up delegates. So, the guess there is he probably had some experienced people doing this.
Yes, I imagine that he would have had access to that.
Not enough. But,
right.
That's how that worked. Klobuchar went 13, 13, 13. Everybody else lost. Everybody else was out. Yang, Steyer, uncommitted, nothing. The way it worked out right now is that because of the debacle about reporting,
yes,
everybody was kind of in limbo. And so what happened? Warren didn't do much and said, let's wait. Bernie said, I don't know about these caucuses. Pete said, I won.
Yes.
Okay. And Biden said, the whole system sucks. Maybe I should sue.
Uh, did he? He's now denying
He did.
it.
I mean, he sent a threatening letter to the Iowa Democratic Committee. And what I'm trying to say is,
What are you trying to
you
do?
learn just
I
as
don't
much
know.
by how people react as you do about looking at the final totals. And of those four, you'd have to say Pete had the most interesting, arguably best/worst response. You know, a lot of chutzpah saying you won when the votes aren't in, but getting out there first and saying I won is the image that people remember.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen that trick before. It's usually Republicans that do
2000 and George W. Bush. I mean, but, okay, fine. You learn from that, and that's what you do. I'm just saying, in terms of how they reacted, it tells you a whole lot about who their campaigns are.
Yes, that's true. I did see. I mean, there's a lot of praise among the. I guess some of the Elizabeth Warren fans for her even-keeled response, which was neither here nor there.
Which was third place, and nobody remembers what it was.
Yeah, right.
This was not a good showing for her.
No, so the statement didn't do much for her.
Again, I think it was worse for Biden, but the fact is that discussion about whether caucuses should exist and how bad the reporting was and how it all screwed up actually helped Biden because nobody got a chance to talk about how bad his performance was.
That's true. I did see plenty of people found ways to make time to discuss that, but that
came second and third and fourth,
and it was not a surprise to a whole lot of people. Really,
no,
I mean, I guess it was weird.
He certainly didn't have the ground game in Iowa, and he only made a late showing there. But this was also one of those, younger people came out and voted, and they didn't vote for Biden. And so what happens now? Now we have New Hampshire next, and it's coming up soon. And the polls there show Bernie with a solid lead and Biden in second. But is that really second? And New Hampshire polling, for the most part, sucks. For example, in 2016, it picked Bernie as the winner, but, got the margin wrong by like 11 points. So, does anybody really know what's going on? What else happened?
Yes.
The turnout in Iowa wasn't all that great.
True.
It was no better than 2016. And so if people were expecting a wave of angry people willing to vote for anybody, that's not how it worked. But on the other hand, maybe that's not the way it's supposed to work. And I got a thread on that from Rachel Bidikofer also. Some thoughts on turnout. Definitely think impeachment and Super Bowl, as Nate Silver opined, mattered. But maybe more important was the sense of too many choices and the prospect of having to endure a public process where your preference isn't viable and then you have to realign. That's a weird dynamic. Imagine being the Tulsi person.
I will not.
Standing by yourself, right? And you have to assume there are some people that find the prospect of publicly dickering over their vote choices terrifying. This might have been compounded about worries among voters. There'd be divisiveness between supporters of different candidates. And we do know when people are given too many choices, some shut down. There may also have been a sense from voters of not wanting responsibility of choosing. One common theme in the polling has been that voters really want to beat Trump but have no idea what kind of candidate best does it. So sitting out is a way to avoid responsibility for reaching that. But ultimately, it was the amorphous competition of the cycle compared to the two-person competitions in 8 and 16. People should keep in mind a couple of things. The reason everybody predicted high turnout is every major election since Trump has produced at least a 10-point turnout bump, but those are all generals. This is our primary, and it's not even a real primary, it's a caucus. So almost none of the Dem primaries since Trump has produced large turnout, but increases. Virginia governor 2017 did, and the generals went on to produce big turnout bumps. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the regular primary states. One other point, though, is the reason that Sanders is either going to lose to Buttigieg or come close to doing so is because there was no youth turnout surge in Iowa, at least not a big one. And also new caucus goers wasn't as much as previous years. So should probably mention that along with all the major rules changes, party officials tell me today that many more precincts were moved to accommodate the anticipated turnout. So it's also possible that that contributed to lower than expected turnout. So they did everything to make it more accessible, except it was still a caucus. And it turned out all the stuff that they did probably hurt rather than helped.
Well, yeah. unintended consequences. We spoke
Exactly.
about that on Monday.
We'll make it more accessible. We'll move your caucus place and not get the word out.
Right. Well, or even if you do, right. That I saw that come up as conspiracy theory early in, or I guess late last week. Well, they're moving all the places, and that's voter suppression. Well, it can be used as a voter suppression tool, but I think they advertised it pretty loudly, and B, I mean, I guess if it counts for anything, it was done with good intentions.
Right. It was. But, it's an unwieldy process, and now you're making it even more unwieldy.
Yes.
So here's some new Iowa caucus analysis from Andrew Theriault. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but what he basically does is, and a lot of these political scientists that I follow actually went to Iowa and planted themselves in one of the caucuses and are giving us real-time descriptions of what's going on. And what Theriault's talking about is interesting. For example, Biden and Sanders electorates don't overlap much, which isn't really a surprise. Their voters don't like each other.
Yeah.
When Biden didn't make it to the final round, but Sanders did, Sanders only got like 9.6% of Biden's voters. Mm-hmm. In the reverse, it was 7.8. So the takeaway here, the two groups don't really get along. Not a surprise, but interesting to see it quantified. And to a lesser extent, you see that between Biden and Buttigieg. Biden and Klobuchar got along. The people who were voting for them or thinking about voting for them.
Okay.
Pete's is different. And so, again, when you try to lump these folks into, well, this is the moderate lane and this is the progressive lane, it doesn't work that way.
No. All right.
Right? Klobuchar voters almost never went to Sanders and in the other direction, even less so than Biden. And that seems pretty hostile, though maybe she's not the best example of Minnesota nice. Who knows? That's what Andrew says.
Yes.
And then when Sanders wasn't viable, his voters went largely for Warren. She got 44% of his up for grabs. Compare that to the other numbers I was giving you. Okay. But that wasn't true in the other direction.
Huh.
Sanders was few voters' second choice.
Strong preference for first choice. That does count for something.
Right. But, in terms of growing the pool of people willing to vote for you, not so much.
All right. One contest, true. Let's get back to it after a brief 2-minute break. It's interesting. We'll continue with this thread unless we have to hurry along, and I think we'll be right back. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Well, we continue with Greg Dworkin. We were in the middle of one of the tweet threads about the Iowa caucuses, which were terrible, but we were examining exactly, not why they were terrible. We already went over why they're terrible, but
the individual caucuses themselves ran okay.
Place.
It wasn't the problem wasn't that granular level. The problem was at the state level.
Although I did identify some problems. I have a thread on some of the individual caucus problems. It's just interesting from a procedural perspective. But yes,
sure, we have those. I have a whole box explainer on the coin flips and the pulling names out of a hat.
Did they have a hat?
Yeah, because there was a three-way tie, so they couldn't do a coin flip.
Really?
Yeah,
that's
really
good.
was.
I like they have a backup plan. Wait a minute.
So they had a backup plan. They had a plan C.
We have a 20-way tie, which means we have to juggle chainsaws or something.
Right.
I don't know what. Okay.
Is this any way to pick a candidate? Well, So yeah, we'll talk about that. Anyway, getting to the end here, in Andrew Theobald Theriault's thread here.
Right. Yes.
There's some interesting observations about the people who voted and how they feel about each other. So, getting to the end. In terms of less successful candidates, Yang's voters weren't into Biden or Warren. Steyer's didn't like Warren. That's not a surprise. But they like Biden. Uncommitted voters mostly vote for Biden. So getting to the end, if and when Klobuchar gets out of the race, her voters seem likely to split the support among everybody but Sanders, which could get interesting if it happens soon, since the other three major candidates are within striking distance in New Hampshire. But again, Bernie leads there. The simplistic view of lumping together candidates by ideology, Biden, Buttigieg, or Sanders, Warren, doesn't really hold up when you look at where people went when they reshuffled in the caucuses. The voters don't see them as interchangeable. So it's hard to predict the dynamics of the race when it winnows further. I think that's probably the most important insight out of all of this. It isn't, high school who likes who and who. It's just that what can you expect to happen based on who's left? And that said, it seems like Biden and Sanders, Andrew says, are basically at or near their ceilings, so there are not many folks' second choices. So when it gets to be a three-person race, that can potentially help Pete or Elizabeth more than either of the other two. Right now, it's still a race with four people. So in terms of who's next to go from the list, we won't be able to say that until after a few more states have voted, and nothing from the Iowa results gives much hint. Okay. So it's kind of interesting, and he was doing this as a rush job, but he's doing this based on the granularity of going to each individual caucus and trying to figure out where people went and how they resorted. And I think it's interesting insight I just didn't see anywhere else.
Yes. Well, no one cared that much, but they did.
It's a question of where they go if you're not, if you're not seen as viable, where does your candidates go? And that's really the name of the game for the Democratic primary at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's supposed to be more broadly applicable. I don't know if it's a great analog, but it's what they've got, so they go with it. They should stop going with it, but they continue to for now. All right.
Right.
Very strange.
So the other part that the Iowa Democratic Party came into criticism over was once things screwed up and it was clear that their killer app had killed their ability to announce quickly.
That's the killer part.
It's the killer part. Killed the caucus. Then they made the decision to give partial results.
Yeah. I was confused by that.
A lot of people were. Philip Bump writes in the Washington Post, Iowa Democrats are poised to do the one thing that could make the caucus debacle worse.
Okay.
Releasing partial results tanks one of the few positive aspects from Monday's contest. You could say we're doing it carefully, we're doing it by hand, we're taking our time, we'll give you the and they didn't.
I wasn't quite as disappointed with that. I guess my confusion arose from I am used to being told that there are partial results. Everybody stays up late to see partial results on TV all the time. Well, with 32% of precincts reporting, it's this. And everybody says, yeah, but where's Waukesha? And,
Yeah, this is Philip Bump's, and where's that car with the ballots in the trunk?
Yeah.
Philip Bump reports this. Jeremy Bird, who ran Barack Obama's field program, criticized the Iowa party for its deployment of a tool intended to make counting the results of the caucuses easier, that is, that killer app. But he did offer one compliment to how the party was managing the disaster. The Iowa Democratic Party, quote, smartly did not release inaccurate or partial data, he wrote on Twitter. We're going to get accurate results. Patience is a virtue we can cultivate here. And Philip Bump added, so much for that.
Yeah, I guess. But it didn't upset me nearly as much.
Yeah, it was interesting. But, for those who wanted to claim victory, it's very frustrating because you don't know when the next tranche is going to come.
Right. I love
right.
tranches.
And in fact, here it is Wednesday morning, and we still don't have very much more than what we had when they released the first one. So they released it at 61%. Now we have 71%, and we still haven't moved from there.
Mm-hmm. It's slow.
And we don't know when it's coming, and so that's not helpful. So now everybody's moving on from the Iowa caucus, and what good is that?
I don't know. I think it's great.
Now, this is reporting from Holly Otterbein. Bernie Sanders' camp envisioned him potentially giving a primetime victory speech in Iowa, raising millions from small donors and savoring proving so many elites wrong. Instead, they reassured demoralized aides and volunteers Tuesday. That's how it felt. The feeling at his caucus night wasn't gloom and doom. CBS reported the smell of pot wafted through the air. Some Sanders fans talked about how if he eventually placed first, followed by Buttigieg second, it would be about the best possible outcome, but the mood was tense and anticlimactic. What could have been an historic night for Sanders and his movement was not, at least not in the way they hoped. His campaign manager later told aides in a call to appreciate what had happened despite bad press, Sanders was ahead. And he was in the number of votes, but not in the delegate count.
Yeah.
And so again, it just you get a sense in there. It's not to dump on Bernie, but it's get what they wanted and how it was supposed to work, and then not having the results and how it spoiled things.
It did. Well, it's and it I guess potentially spoiled things. Even for Buttigieg, didn't really get what he wanted.
Yeah, he should have.
Gotten
Buttigieg actually had the most delegates, and he should be getting I won Iowa. And let's move on to New Hampshire. He didn't get that either because like everybody's still saying, well, whatever happened in Iowa, I forgot. But all I know is they didn't. What happened? Did they cancel it?
So bad for everybody. Even the winners lost. And then they get written up as the smell of pot wafting through the air. That was super helpful too.
Incredible, right? But then again, it's legal in a lot of places.
Alexandra Petri. That issue. It's just
so I was at a caucus where they had some problems. I went to the Iowa caucuses because I love democracy, she wrote. Well, I'm a fan of its earlier work. Yes. And I was excited to see it in action. What I saw instead was people fighting a valiant fight against voter preference cards and the clock and losing.
Yeah, well,
there's no more powerful force than somebody with a bright idea for a new way things should go who doesn't have to live with the consequences. Somebody in an office somewhere devises a form or an app, and then on the ground people struggle and strain over a confusingly worded directive, and it makes the difference between receiving a benefit or not, or having your voice heard or not, or being the room where the future of America gets decided. Mm-hmm. Oh, well.
Well, what's the news there? Butterfly ballot. I'm a huge fan of the earlier work, too.
Right, exactly. So, maybe the best thing that happened is that CNN had to hem and haw when the DMR poll wasn't available for an hour, And by the way, the DMR poll being pulled once again proves that the DMR poll is the most accurate thing to tell you about what's going to happen.
It was a total disaster, and so will the caucuses be. Just wait and see. And they were right.
As it turned out.
Amazing.
When they actually got a hold of Nate Silver got the actual poll, It really wasn't bad. He had Sanders 22, Warren 18, Biden 13, and those are all about what they got. Mm-hmm. Sanders got 24, Warren got 19, and Biden got 15. And Seltzer had Buttigieg at 16, and he wound up with 62% reporting, getting up to 21. But again, he's the one that efficiently scooped up all of the non-viable candidate stuff. Right. So that actually was a pretty decent poll because Ann Seltzer is a pretty good pollster. So. In the end.
All right. Well, it was predictive in many
ways.
We
just didn't know.
Yeah. And I guess the big lesson is don't program live television shots around, well, I guess probably anything.
That was Dave Hopkins' piece. Anyway. It's time to de-hype the Iowa caucuses, if not get rid of them entirely. At least stop doing it like a giant media show.
Yeah, that would be wise. A lot of things that CNN gets caught in that a lot. For some reason, I now jump back to them racing out of the Supreme Court building with a decision in their hands that they didn't know how to read correctly. And we're first, but we're wrong.
Yeah. Well, I keep thinking of Al Capone's vault.
Well, yeah. There you go. Right. Don't do things like that on live TV if you don't know what's going to happen.
Right. And then Nate Silver, was kind of pissed because Iowa screwed up his model. Iowa might have screwed up the whole nomination process, says the headline.
Oh, well.
And then he talks about how it screwed up his model.
Yeah, well, I guess that's the big deal for him.
Right. But, what he points out is that, it's only 41 delegates. It's only 41 of the Democrats' 3,979 pledged delegates.
Very true.
But they estimate in their model that Iowa was the second most important date on the calendar this year, trailing only Super Tuesday, he writes. It was worth the equivalent of almost 800 delegates, or 20 times its actual number, in terms of the media hype and how it sets the narrative.
Mm-hmm. Now, okay. And now
that's
all that hype
That's another
gone.
reason to get rid of Iowa.
Yeah, or at least for going first. And certainly the caucus, well, I don't know, the caucus thing, it might work next time. Who knows?
If there is a next time.
Yeah. Right, I know. They could roll the dice on it. I wonder what.
What else could happen? Maybe Iowa doesn't go first.
That would be a good idea too.
Anyway, these are all things. So this is what happened, and again, the confusion, the bad feelings, the you screwed up. I mean, that all pervaded, 2 days worth of coverage, followed by the State of the Union, which was basically a fascist rally for Trump. And so that's why everybody's like in such a gloomy mood.
Okay. Well, I can by that. You should be.
So I was really
Big
happy
toys
that
got taken
Nancy
away.
Pelosi ripped up his speech. I thought that was great.
I liked it. I was hoping, I guess after the fact when she did it and I realized she was up for a stunt, I was thinking, she might have written something in Sharpie on the back and held it up
Well,
in the shot,
She thought of
Lie.
it because somebody said to her, "Why did you rip up the speech?" And she
Yeah,
said, "Because it was a lot more polite than the alternative,"
Right.
which would have been what you suggested.
Yeah, people suggest
balling up the speech and
light
throwing
it
it.
on fire. Right.
Thing she could have done.
I also thought she should accidentally drop the gavel on his head. Maybe would be a good idea. Well, all right.
I was just looking at the MSN tracking poll this morning. And I'll simply point out for your listeners that the supporter opposed the Senate voting to remove President Trump from office hasn't budged. And do you approve or disapprove of Trump as president? That hasn't budged. These are all tracking polls. And if the president election were held today, who would you vote for? And that would be 51% the Democrat and 39% the Republican. And that hasn't budged. So we'll see. We'll see what happens with like a week from now when all this stuff sinks in. You got to wait that long to really get a sense of where the polls are at. But that's our baseline. It's not like everything is falling apart. And what this week tells us for Democrats is we still have a lot of work to do, and we still don't. We badly want to beat Trump, but we really don't know who our candidate's going to be yet. We just don't know.
Yeah. Well. Okay.
If I were Pete, I'd be in a best mood, I think, of the candidates. If I were Bernie, I'd be cautiously optimistic and looking forward to New Hampshire. If I were Elizabeth Warren, I'd be a bit worried because finishing, let's say, out of the money for 2 states, including one that is right near your home state of Massachusetts, isn't a great look. And if I were Biden, I'd be very worried because you can't afford to have as bad a showing in New Hampshire and certainly Nevada as you did in Iowa and then expect South Carolina to save you. It doesn't work that way.
I mean, a lot of people do expect that. I mean, not necessarily
I'm
for
just
him,
setting up
but
expectations.
They do, they run around expecting that all the time. And then a lot of people run out of money waiting for South
And Biden is one of the people running out of money.
Oh. Well,
and finishing third or fourth doesn't inspire people to open up their wallets and give you money, and it doesn't inspire people to work for you.
I guess not. I was wondering whether there was no mention of Steyer being targeted for next to drop out, and is that just because he doesn't care about money?
No, because first of all, he's got a lot of self-funding if he wishes, but also he's doing fairly well in South Carolina. He's the one that might be stealing some votes away from Biden in South Carolina because he's doing heavy advertising there. The folks down in South Carolina are telling us.
Okay.
And one name I should mention is that one of the other big winners here.
Yes.
Mike Bloomberg.
Well, he's also got a lot of money.
He's got a lot of money. Somebody asked him, so how do you feel about having 2 billionaires in this race? And he said, who's the other one?
Yeah, and he's right. That was good. Probably his best line in a long time.
But the point is, he's playing a different game than the others. He didn't invest in Iowa, and he didn't invest in New Hampshire. He's investing in other places. He's going for Super Tuesday. And if Biden does falter, he's in a position, doesn't mean that he'll succeed, of picking up some of those delegates and at least having a say at the convention.
Yeah. All right. Very interesting and unexpected. Yeah. Speaking of
and what if it's a Pete versus Bernie race in the end?
Oh, I don't know.
That's also unexpected, but I mean, if you're looking at Iowa, that's what happened.
True. Bizarre. I'm not really ready for that. But,
you have a week.
Yeah, okay. Well,
so
that's
I'm telling
enough.
you this week, so you can be ready next week.
Okay.
Because we go on to New Hampshire, and we don't have enough New Hampshire polling to know what kind of bounce, if any, Mayor Pete's going to get, or Pete formerly known as Mayor will get, based on what happened in the muddle in Iowa.
Yeah.
Right? But we do have a slew of New Hampshire polling, none of it good. It all came out today or yesterday.
Good.
Suffolk University has Bernie up by 9. Emerson, which is a terrible poll, has Bernie up by 16. Ipsos has Biden up by 3. St. Anselm has them tied, Biden and Bernie. And YouGov has Sanders by 5. And that tells us nothing because none of that is really great polling and none of it is, taking into account what happened in Iowa.
I guess.
Which we don't have the final yet.
Yeah. Right. Man. All right.
So it's a mess.
So yes. We'll just have to sit through it, I suppose. And
My presentation today was a mess, but that's because, the world's in a mess.
well, that's all right. I can understand that, and I forgive you for it. And I was just thinking of you had mentioned about Tom Steyer and his weird advertising. Well, it's not so weird. I mean, it makes sense. Advertising in South Carolina, and I was reminded of a story that I don't know if I set aside or not, and I think it was a candidate, a Republican congressional candidate from South Carolina, just because South Carolina and advertising, it came to mind, that had a very unusual strategy for his television advertising and was advertising in Florida over the weekend, targeting Donald Trump. He had bought all sorts of TV time around West Palm Beach, hoping that Donald Trump would see him on TV while he was at Mar-a-Lago and decide to back him versus his primary opponent in the Republican primary in whatever state they were from, which was not Florida. It was just sort of, I think it was South Carolina, but now I can't find the story. It doesn't ring a bell for. If anybody knows what the hell I'm talking about, please contact me and let me know.
Right. No, I did see something like that.
Okay.
Why are you advertising in Florida? You have nothing to do with Florida. Because I want the boss to see.
Yeah.
So let me just give you
TV.
the latest South Carolina poll that I could find, and that's the Post and Courier. It's from January 26th through January 29th, so it's relatively recent but not totally fresh. 651 likely voters. Has Joe Biden in South Carolina at 25. Mm-hmm. Okay. Sanders at 20. Steyer at 18. Warren at 11. Buttigieg at 7, Yang at 3, Gabbard 3, Klobuchar at 2. So it's a Biden plus 5 poll. And when people saw that, they said, but Biden's doing much better than that in South Carolina compared to everything that is conventional wisdom. And the people down there are saying, you should see the number of Steyer ads that are playing uncontested down here. It's unbelievable. You can't turn the TV on and not see Tom Steyer.
Yeah, well, you can buy up the whole thing if you do it early. No one's going to spend their money that way.
Telling you what's going on there. Yeah. So, does that translate to, well, that's how they're going to vote? Arguably South Carolina is the most pragmatic of all the early states. So let's see.
They love TV just like everybody else. I mean,
yeah,
it's clearly working if that polling has anything to say about it. So, 18, what was it? 18%?
18%.
That's got to be his television advertising. What else could it be?
Right. Here's an earlier one. Okay. This is from January 5th through January 8th from Fox News that had Biden at 36, Steyer in second at 15, Sanders at 14, and Warren at 10. So Steyer is a known quantity in South Carolina by now because of the advertising, and that's all I'll say about it.
Okay. That's clearly the issue. But all right, I guess it's not determinative, and I guess the time between now and then,
that's absolutely right,
is all about everybody discovering, there are other candidates, and I know who they are now, and then they'll advertise on TV, and I imagine he drops down, but I can't imagine a whole lot of people latching on with loyalty. Well, he was the first one who bothered me in the middle of my football game, so I'll stick with him. I don't know. Name recognition. And isn't Rachel Bidikofer is always talking about that right now the answers to these polls are about name recognition more than anything else.
Bernie and Biden are name recognition, and the lack of support by the others is a lack of name recognition.
Except if
Steyer's going to advertise, then you can change that equation. Same with Bloomberg.
Right. That thing there that you said. Those words. That's the ones I wanted. Okay. So the presentation, not such a mess after all.
Yeah. Anyway, I'll leave you with a little summary from Talking Points memo about the State of the Union in the middle of it. Trump promised that he'll always protect pre-existing conditions, a vow that rang hollow given the several Trump-supported bills, administrative actions, and lawsuits that would dismantle those protections. Democrats groaned and booed. And then came his warning that there are those who want to take away your health care, take away your doctor, and abolish private insurance entirely. Yeah, you, Democrats shouted back at him, getting even more riled. So that's pretty much how the night went.
Yeah, not as bad as it could have been, and nobody actually just stood up and did the you lie thing or anything like that.
Yeah, nobody got caned, which is a good thing.
True, right. You don't want that if you can avoid it at all. All right, so not everything it could have been, but also not the disaster that it could have been. A Trump veering off the rails and screaming about impeachment, or making fun of the Iowa caucuses. I thought both were a real possibility.
As Shannon Pettypiece points out in Twitter, Pelosi's tearing up of the speech move was Trumpian in the effect that it's having. It's scoring her points with the base, made her the story, generating the type of outrage from conservatives that we see from liberals over Trump's antics.
Yes.
Welcome to 2020. I'm going to have a cup of coffee, and we'll be back tomorrow and see how all of this sinks in after 24 hours. And, of course, we'll have the impeachment vote today, which is a foregone conclusion, but putting the exclamation mark over everything we know about the Republican Party, including the so-called moderates.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, you will have to sit and collect that news for tomorrow and decide
what to do with it.
If anything,
we'll talk about it.
Yeah, okay.
All righty. Take care, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.
All right, will do. Thanks, Greg. Appreciate it. We'll check in again tomorrow. There were a couple other stories I thought that were interesting out of Iowa, including... well, let's see. What was the counterpoint to this? Yes, right. I remember. There were two stories that I thought were interesting all by themselves, and then they sort of had a point side by side, even though, I don't know, most people... It could be a totally invalid point, I guess. But I did see circulating yesterday rather widely this video... which is embedded in here, and it's too long to play all the way through, but maybe you saw it. But this was this is the description that went along with the video as tweeted by Annabelle Park. Anyway, and I saw a lot of people tweeting the video. I don't know where it came from originally. Maybe it was hers originally, and I just saw other people retweeting it. I don't know. But anyway, this was a weird moment. A little dismaying, but interesting in the way it's presented here. The other person who might otherwise not be the focus of this little bit of video in our outrage generation instead focuses elsewhere. It's I'll just read you what Annabelle says. Pete Buttigieg, precinct captain in rural Iowa, not named as far as I can tell here, but maybe in some of the comments, responds to a caucus goer flipping out upon learning that he, Buttigieg, has a same-sex partner. It's a masterclass in patience, persistence, and love. Okay, and it is Bravo, and I guess maybe his name's the person involved. Bravo, Nikki Heaver, is that right? And although for some reason I can't bring up that profile, maybe that's the right name, wrong Twitter account. But anyway, I saw a lot of people tweeting this one around, and it was very odd. So this person essentially had handed in, I don't know what they had done at this point because the caucus is so weird. But I guess you also, in addition to standing in corners and moving around from time to time and then arguing with people, you fill out cards. They're of some importance. They may or may not bind you to various things. I don't know the rules, and that's, I guess, the point of the second thread that I'll provide after our top of the hour break with some real insight from somebody who actually knows what's going on in Iowa and the Iowa caucuses. But this discussion here is very interesting. But basically, I guess she's written down her preferences and handed in her card, I guess, to the precinct captain. And I suppose they're supposed to have those cards in order to maybe help them corral people who had said they were going to caucus for their candidate, and they have some idea of how many people they should have in their corner. And if they don't have that number, or they are missing people they know had said they were going to be there, they can go and rustle them up and make sure they've got them in time for the alignment. And this woman, homophobic, I guess, and just decides, I didn't realize it. And how you get this far into it, and how you come to the caucuses ready to caucus for Pete Buttigieg and not knowing that. I don't know. On the one hand, it's like, where have you been? But on the other hand, it's not like he runs around saying, I'm Pete Buttigieg and I'm the gay candidate for president. It's, it's not top of mind for a lot of people, but still, at some point, presumably if we hand you this job, you're supposed to do it right. But most people in Iowa are most people everywhere. They only know a little bit about it, but the date has come and they got to express a presidential preference, so they do it. And I guess she was dazzled, as many people are, by his speaking abilities and his many talents. And, good, I guess, that all of this served to impress this woman and that she never bothered to even ask or find out what was going on with his private life. And I guess I'm glad for that. And interestingly here, the precinct captain holds out some hope that maybe she can be made to see the folly of her insistence that she wants to change her mind based on something so inconsequential. Not to him. To him it's rather consequential, but supposedly be for the rest of us. The ideas, the platform, the manner of speaking, what have you, is supposed to be far more important. And so a very impressive performance by the precinct captain trying to persuade her. But don't you think you ought to make your decision based on more substantive reasoning? Don't you think that it's okay? And don't you think, as I teach my son, it doesn't matter who we love. You love who you love, and it's up to you, and it doesn't have an impact on the rest of us. And besides which, it's just absolutely, at this stage of the game, you should be you should be willing to acknowledge it as a normal part of everyday life, and you can safely ignore it. And she wasn't persuading this person, but it wasn't a bitter fight, and that was nice to see. What really struck me about the thing was this idea of this woman saying, I'd like to have my card back. Not just so much, I was obviously struck first by the reasons that she was asking for her card back, but I was struck also by the fact that she thought she would be allowed to have it back. I don't know what the rules actually are on that, but I assume that at some point a bright line is drawn, and when you hand in your card, you hand in your card. It's not like, I guess maybe the fact that they do their caucusing face to face this way, and it's just another person, and it's not, Washington D.C. officialdom that has your ballot or card or what have you. But in a voting state, I think most people would never think to ask, can I have that back? No, of course not. That's just not done. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Okay, well, anyway, let's see where I was with this strange story. We're at the end of the first of these strange stories, but have to skip around to find the various screens I have for this thing. I hold that up next to another very interesting story, and this one more process-oriented, but the same thought struck me, and you'll see why perhaps, as we make our way through this one. This one from Bleeding Heartland, who actually is an Iowan. Look at this. I don't think I have noticed this change in particular, but now I guess change the username or change the address name to Bleeding Heartland's, I suppose, real life name, Laura R. Bellin, but it was always just Bleeding Heartland and at Bleeding Heartland all this time. And who knows? Maybe this is several years old and I just haven't noticed it along the way. But she, of course, well-versed in not only in Iowa politics, but in the procedure and process of the caucusing. So anyway, this has been very interesting to look at. This discusses at that granular level of an individual caucus procedural mistakes. She's retweeting the tweet of Todd Dorman, D-O-R-M-A-N, columnist for Gazette, thegazette.com, the Gazette paper that we were reading yesterday, one of the local Iowa papers, but I can't recall exactly which, but you remember the story. Happened to come up yesterday. Anyway, Todd Dorman writing this. I wonder if I should go and take a look. Does it have... Yeah, he's got a whole article that goes with it, so maybe we'll start with that one. Rule mistake makes a caucus mess in Marion. And here's the article on it. Let's see. In Marion's Precinct 5, caucus night got messy. And I guess here's how. Well, I was rooting for you, Iowa caucuses, said my daughter, Tess, who was caucusing for the first time and witnessed firsthand how things can go very wrong. She got her sarcasm from someplace, presumably Dad. On the north side of Marion, at Excelsior Middle School, things went south on the north side, you see, with the first alignment count Monday night. This year's introduction of preference cards, so I guess that's a new thing. So I guess the other woman could be, may perhaps be excused from not being clear on whether or not you can get your preference card back, or even what the preference card means. This year's introduction of preference cards caused some confusion, and when the numbers were tallied, the group supporting Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren fell one person short of viability. Okay, so I guess they were counting the cards as opposed to the people in the corner. I don't know whether that's somehow easier to do. I guess it would be easier to count and to recount to make sure you got the count correct. And if you're counting people and somebody goes to the bathroom or gets a drink of water, it can cause havoc. I don't know why those cards are new. I guess they just are. Or maybe the styling of the cards is new as well. Just a reminder, though, like we were talking about with Greg, so many of these things are introduced with all the best intentions and to make things foolproof. And this new thing will prevent X, and it ends up causing Y. Where it's a familiar story, particularly with procedure. Very often things that are implemented as reforms and very often as transparency reforms at that end up causing problems, and whenever there are problems and tensions rise, people these days sort of immediately go to, if not conspiracy theory, then thinking that something nefarious has been done. And then you have a situation where a reform that was supposed to avoid recriminations and infighting has just simply created a new arena for recriminations and infighting. Anyway, so here's what happened. Warren ends up one person short of viability according to the cards. Warren had 40 backers and needed 41 to reach 15% viability in a precinct that drew 272 caucus goers. Warren backers looked stunned as the count was announced. And indeed they should be. Sanders, in that initial count, was viable by only a single vote. Wow. What a contest there. Warren supporters were then told by caucus volunteers that they would not be allowed to combine with supporters of other non-viable candidates to become viable. The volunteers were wrong, as a call later to Democratic officials confirmed. Team Warren could have built a viable second chance coalition under the rules. And I mean, is that not the way it's always been? I'm not certain what I'm reading here. Warren says this is the first alignment. You're one short. And all right, well, for whatever reason, they told the Warren people, you are not viable, you're out. They treated it like second alignment when it was in fact first alignment. Some dejected Warren voters switched candidates. Some simply left before the mistaken rules interpretation was corrected. Warren backers who stayed tried to get their realigned supporters back. There was much counting and cajoling and consternation, but Warren still fell short. Are you going to report how this was a beep show? I think that was probably a crap show, but in slightly different language. Asked Megan Lang, a Warren supporter, I guess asking this of Todd Dorman, if this is going on in other caucuses, how reliable is it? We had to do 2 hours of training so we knew how it was supposed to work, said Diane Bean, another Warren backer, who wondered whether volunteers were trained well enough. Nate Harris caucused for the first time to support Warren. I'm just sort of imagining the scene here, the confusion, the chaos, the anger, and of course recriminations. You're doing this because you're fixing it for who? Sanders was barely viable himself. Who would you accuse of fixing it? I don't know where your mind would go to first, but I mean, here it is. It's just an honest maybe. All right, let's say it's an honest mistake, but then it's like, how could you make this particular kind of mistake? The rules are so clear, and when you write them, you're like, well, we'll make the rules perfectly clear, and we'll have 2-hour-long training for people running the caucuses. And then, I mean, if you make the rules clear and you train people for 2 hours, you're not going to have this problem. The rule is clear. This is how it's supposed to work. Well, people are just going to F things up and do the wrong thing for various reasons, many of which may have to do with stupidity and some of which may have to do with nefarious conspiracies. But people will, make that mistake because it's a dumb and complicated system, and the more dumb and complicated you make it, the more errors there are going to be. You won't have this particular error in a voting primary, in a secret ballot primary, because there's just no opportunity to have it. But you do have mistakes that are just as dumb in voting primaries. It's just it's rarer because there are just fewer opportunities to make the mistake. But I mean, if you're a poll worker, or you know somebody who's been a poll worker, or you've read stories about what poll workers are reporting, you know that on occasion, with hundreds of millions of people casting ballots, not in any state primary, but in a general election, but you get the idea. Across the country, millions of people are casting these ballots, and you'd think, I'm giving you a ballot that has 2 names on it. Check one. And hand it back. You've seen, if you've ever read the news coverage of a recount of any kind, you're astonished by it, and you can't imagine it's true until you read that it is. But, you hand people a piece of paper that has 2 names on it and say, check one. Because hundreds of millions of people are doing this, it's just the law of large numbers. 10 people. You would think how could it possibly be true? 10, 20, 100 people will hand you back a paper that has 2 checks on it. Or no checks on it. And you know what to do with those, but, make an X. Don't make any other kind of mark. Just an X. Nothing else. And you'll get check marks, you'll get circles. You'll get people who will draw Y's on there. It doesn't make any sense at all, and there's no opportunity to go back to them and ask them, what the hell are you talking about here? And here maybe caucusing has one advantage over straight up secret ballot voting, which is somebody gives you their preference card and it's all screwed up, and you can go back to them and say, what does this mean? You wrote Pete Buttigieg, and then you wrote it's scribble after this. So I need to know who's your second preference for various reasons, whatever it is. Or I need to know your first preference. I can't read your writing. You can go back and ask them. I suppose there's that on behalf of caucuses. It's conducted live and face to face. But you'd be amazed how many stupid mistakes there are. If you have one of those Scantron voting sheets, and there's instructions right on it, fill in the bubble, fill it in all the way. Don't write outside of the bubble. Don't make an X on the bubble you want. Don't circle the bubble you want. Fill it in. And every year, hundreds, that one's a very popular mistake. Hundreds of people make X's. Fill it in a stupid way. Fill in 1/2 of it. I don't know how people come up with the dumbest possible things. People scratch out somebody else's name that's on the ballot, and although there's a write-in place, they don't use the write-in place. They scratch out that name, and they write that name that they wanted to put on the write-in line, and they put it on the regular Democrat or Republican line because they don't know what they're doing. All the instructions are there. It just doesn't matter. They do it anyway. Mistakes are made. Anyway, so this one in particular seems extraordinarily dumb, but, and I guess they might have thought, what are the odds that all X number of people who are there as precinct captains and precinct secretaries all are poorly trained in exactly the same way and don't know to resort to calling the Democratic Party hotline and asking the question? Very low, but it happens in one place, in Marion, at this one middle school. Okay, so volunteers messed up. I guess I missed one comment here. So let's see. This is like a badly organized middle school assembly, Harris said, and it was in a middle school, so that makes sense. As a young voter, this is very disappointing. It's disappointing for anybody. Volunteers messed up, and their late efforts to pull Marion 5 out of the dumpster fire might have fared better if more people had waited to go from being caucus goers to home goers. By the time the problem was identified, too few Democrats remained in the gym for a replay call. We regret the confusion, said Barb Wild, a caucus volunteer. She encouraged Warren supporters to document the problems so lessons can be learned. A complaint is likely. Aside from that big mistake, how did North Marion Democrats enjoy the caucuses? Well, let's find out. I'm sort of curious about it. Former South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg won the most support with 87 votes, translating into 3 delegate equivalents. Amy Klobuchar and Bernie Sanders, who picked up support on realignment, tied with 57 votes and 2 delegates each. Joe Biden got a delegate from his 53-vote support. The fact that moderate candidates did so well isn't surprising. Actually, we never got an answer to how they enjoyed the caucus, but okay. This is the part of Marion that sent moderate Democrat Swati Dandekar to the state Senate. That's, it's maybe meaningless for the rest of us, but for insiders, they know exactly what that means. She was on hand to caucus, by the way, for Klobuchar on Monday night. The precinct also has backed moderate Republicans when they existed, such as the late, great Mary Lundby. Lundby's protege, you can go find out about her at the link here. Lundby's protege, Republican turned Democratic County Supervisor Brent Oleson, caucused for Biden. So there's a centrist streak running through the vinyl castles of North Marion. Revolution is slow growing here. Must be that lack of topsoil. Tess caucused for Klobuchar, although Warren was her second choice. She wondered if she had supported Warren, whether the whole Marion 5 mess of 2020 might have been avoided. We'll never know. One thing we do know, knowing the rules always helps, and I have to agree with him there. And knowing the rules about where to find out what the rules are if you don't actually know the rules is another thing that always helps. And I'm sure that that is plastered all over the place in posters in every caucus location. And yet, what can I tell you? So Laura Bellin, Bleeding Heartland's comment on this grabbed my attention. Inexcusable mistake, she says, by the precinct chair here, cost Warren a delegate. Infuriating to know that happened anywhere. Someone should have demanded that they call the party HQ and look up the rules. And, duh. That's absolutely the case. Let's see. And some comments. Should I just try to stick to Laura's commenting on this thing, I guess? But one of the comments here. Oh, maybe we should read through a couple of them here. Let's see. The one that was there early on was, I guess, from another caucus goer, said, whoa, this is actually very different from the rules that were presented at the training session that I went to, if I recall correctly. My impression was that candidates were viable after the first round were the only options at realignment. You see, that's very interesting too. So the candidates that were viable after the first round were the only options at realignment. So he thought, this particular person, Louis Slovan, if he went to the training and he came away saying, I thought the deal was you all split up, and then at the first alignment, whoever's viable stays viable, of course, but that you can't try. I thought that the rules were that you can't try to become viable once you were declared not viable after the first round. That's what Louis was saying. And my understanding of things was always that, well, the first round was to see who was already viable and to see whether there was anybody close to becoming viable, and could you try to peel off supporters from other groups, particularly other groups that had, say, fewer voters even than you did, who were almost certainly not going to make it to viability, and you could convince them to come to you and make you viable. But I mean, I guess I could see people coming away with the other impression, right? You have a first alignment, you write down the groups that are viable, and you say everybody has to go to one of these groups now. Nobody else. No going to somebody who's not viable. I can see people making that mistake. Laura, of course, chimes in reaction to Louis' comment here. No. The new rules. And I guess maybe that's the thing. The new rules state that people in viable groups, this is interesting too, people who are in viable groups after first alignment, this is also an important point, cannot realign. They are stuck. And I guess that's part of the reason why you would have to have these preference cards so that you could tell when somebody who aligns first for, say, Pete Buttigieg, and then he's viable, and then for some reason decides I'm going to go and maybe I'll leave and caucus for Warren in order to make her viable. You can't do that. That's interesting too. So those people, if you are in a group that turns out to be viable, you're stuck there and you can't realign for second realignment. People in non-viable groups, though, can either join a viable group or band together to make some other group that wasn't viable on the second go-round. And she just says, sorry, your training session misinformed you. That's a very interesting thing. And Louis is just like, wow, that's a pretty important difference. I'm sure I was not the only person who was unclear on this. Luckily, I wasn't a caucus chair. However, we find out that in some places where people like that were the caucus chairs, you just have a huge problem. And I guess that really devalues the results in terms of figuring out, all right, what's really the preference of Democrats in Iowa. It's a very bizarre situation that I guess you just don't imagine when you're designing the rules, because you say, look, I'm trying to make it very clear. These people can realign. Those people can't realign. They have to do this. They have to do that. And there's no mistaking what is and isn't allowed. But if you don't check the rules, or you think you know the rules better than the next person, then I guess you just sit on it there and, okay. That's, wow. All right. Well, that's a very interesting thing. And I guess the reason I put those two stories together, in addition to there just being interesting variants of what can happen in any place, really, but in particular in a caucusing situation, I guess there too, with the questions about who can realign and who can participate in a realignment and who can't. I'm just astonished. I guess maybe I'm less astonished now at the idea that this woman had, that she could have her preference card back to make a change after whatever deadline there is passes, and she hands in the card, deadline or not. Maybe once you part with the card, you're done and there's no revisions allowed. But I guess maybe that makes slightly more sense in the context of, well, I declared my preference and I stood in this corner, but I'm now being given a chance and being asked, in fact, to choose somebody else. I made my choice, but now I'm going to go back and revise it. So I guess I could see why people might come away with the impression that everything is sort of fast and loose at the caucus, and you can make changes because it's just a person-to-person thing. I'm not handing my card over to the Secretary of State and putting it in a locked box to be counted later on. Everything's up for negotiation, including getting my preference card back, because I just found out something that really has kind of been a major feature of the biographical part of the campaign for a long time for a fairly big-name candidate. All right. Well, I found that all very interesting, and two stories in different ways telling us a little something about the weirdness that is the Iowa caucuses and the ways things can go wrong. Okay, let's see. Oh, this thing here should be archived. Get that out of the way. Other stories may or may not be worthy of attention on the day when we'll be voting on the guilt or making a guilty or not guilty decision on an impeached president. But since we already know what Republicans are going to do, we're stuck having to talk about other things like this. One small bore story I guess in the wake of an attempt to raise outrage about various, particular, I guess, celebrities who were seen not to stand for the national anthem at the Super Bowl. Jay-Z and Beyonce, apparently in attendance at the Super Bowl, didn't, chose not to, I don't know, not paying attention, not sure what the decision was all about. Stand for the national anthem. Didn't kneel for the national anthem, but maybe it's like we don't do kneeling. But I guess the thinking is, all right, well, they were making a political statement with it. And, here on the show, okay, that's fine. In conservative outrage land, of course, that's the worst possible thing you can do. And I don't really know who they think they're talking to when they say, that they're terrible people. They didn't stand for the anthem. And so therefore, I mean, the country and Western fans out there are just not going to say, well, that's it. I ain't buying any more Beyonce albums. Well, it wasn't really a big deal in Beyonce purchasing world anyway. Neither am I, of course, but whatever. The point is, you're probably not persuading anybody, to damage her economically with the story. They just wanted the outrage of it. And I did see somebody tweeting yesterday, I think, just sort of the typical knee-jerk reaction to something like that. Like, how dare you, because blah, 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 veterans. And I understand the sentiment, but I thought it was particularly backwards that they were saying, of course, how dare you, many of our best men and women have given their lives so that ingrates like you could enjoy the Super Bowl in peace. So you should have been standing, etc., etc. And I understand the sentiment, but of course that you're skipping right over. This is how well you understand the statement you're making yourself. Yes, they gave their lives so that these two and everybody else could enjoy the Super Bowl in peace. So why aren't you letting them enjoy the Super Bowl in peace? In fact, aren't you dishonoring the memory of those lost in America's wars, the veterans of our United States Armed Forces, et cetera, et cetera? They laid down their lives or risked their lives so that Jay-Z and Beyonce could enjoy the Super Bowl in peace. And here you are harassing them about it. And what happened to the right to be able to enjoy it in peace? So, well, it's not that you're violating their rights by speaking up. Certainly, you're allowed to speak up. But then, just don't invoke the nonsense about their right to enjoy it in peace if you're not going to let them enjoy it in peace. It's a complicated point, and I doubt very much that a right-wing outrage farmer would be likely to understand or acknowledge it. But there it is. Meanwhile, of course, just like we're supposed to be outraged that Nancy Pelosi tore up the speech, even though Donald Trump tears up things all the time, and including important papers that are supposed to be, by law, a part of the presidential archives. So, Nancy Pelosi hasn't violated any law here, just the norms. Trump's violating both norms and the laws. And remember, there are entire, departments of the White House now dedicated to nothing but taping back together important documents that Trump has continued to tear apart or chew up for reasons unknown. So, that apparently doesn't bother anybody, nor have I even seen anybody in the mainstream traditional media bother to mention the fact that if we're supposed to be outraged about tearing things up, then we should be outraged about tearing things up, not just whether it's done on television or not. Meanwhile, after bashing Jay-Z and Beyonce and anybody else, and of course you can always harken back to Colin Kaepernick for these stories. Let's see. We have the news from the Miami Herald, if I can get past their pop-ups. Maybe not. But, how long is this going to take? Okay, look, I'm not interested. This is, I was going to tell you for like the fourth time, I just am not going to be subscribing to the Miami Herald at this point. All right, well, I guess not. Long story short then, as we head into the break, video taken at the president's stupid Super Bowl party, for which, by the way, we paid $3.4 extra million taxpayer dollars to provide security for. video taken at the Super Bowl party during the playing of the national anthem, which shows, I think, the very stupid and weird and forced practice of everybody at the golf club who was watching the Super Bowl with the president on television, standing for the national anthem. Well, you're with the president of the United States. Maybe the spirit grabs you. So everyone stands for watching it on television, which I'm sure people don't do at home. The president, though, meanwhile, distracted and pretending to conduct the band during the national anthem and pointing at people and giving them the thumbs up and chattering away when he should have been standing there, of course, hand over heart. My goodness. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, and I've learned that I either need to update these announcements more often or stop saying that the announcements are brand new. What's not new is that this message, too, is a call for your support in keeping the Kagro in the Morning show on the air. My thanks go out to all of you who do support the show through your donations. The stats say that Kagro in the Morning fans download our program about 2,000 times each weekday, but our donors make up only about 8% of our daily listeners. Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it simple to make easy, secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. If we're helping keep you sane during the Trump era, consider what that's worth. $1 a day? 50 cents? One thin dime? We do about 20 shows a month, so pick a number, do the math, and head to patreon.com/KagroX to let us know. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning show here on Netroots Radio. Let things go a little bit longer from that. Reviewing some comments that have come in the past couple minutes here. Yes, Mike Musson commenting, if the Republicans are so upset about Speaker Pelosi tearing up the speech, they should not be tearing up the Constitution, which their impeachment trial votes. Yes, everyone. I did see a lot of people making that comparison, but, you got to tear it up on television in order for it to count, and nobody's willing to do that. And so I guess that's the big difference here. It was on TV. Can you believe it? All right. By the way, so yes, I never did get to the original of the Miami Herald story, but it is here in Pocket, and so I can read that version of it. But very quickly, I don't think it's a major story, but it, brings up some interesting points. Sarah Blasky is listed here as having the byline on this piece. As others stand at attention for anthem, Trump fidgets, points, pretend conducts the band. President Donald Trump has repeatedly said, of course, all Americans should stand proudly during the national anthem. He was proud of himself, no doubt, and publicly chastises those who don't as disrespectful of the troops and the flag. But during the national anthem at his own Super Bowl watch party on Sunday night, a brief video posted to Instagram shows Trump greeting guests, adjusting his chair, straightening his suit jacket, as other attendees, including First Lady Melania Trump and their teenage son, stand with their hands over their hearts. As the Star-Spangled Banner crescendos, Trump raises both his hands in the air and twirls them around as if conducting the music, because he's such an adult. The video was included, this is interesting too, the video was included in an Instagram story by a real estate agent for a Russian-American firm who frequents Mar-a-Lago and other Trump properties and events. And I believe the Super Bowl watch party was at the West Palm Beach Golf Club and not at Mar-a-Lago itself. But there you go. But, just happened to have been on the Instagram timeline of a guy in real estate, but not just any guy in real estate, a Russian-American firm who buys a membership at Mar-a-Lago and hangs out near the president. It's just a thing. Just happening. Just no coincidence. Whatever. Anyway, or it is a coincidence. Trump entered his party at Trump International Golf Club in West Palm Beach as Demi Lovato was introduced to sing the national anthem at Hard Rock Stadium. Video of the moment shows. I guess that's interesting. I don't think it even registered with me. Hey, who sang the national anthem? Although I did think I heard people say it was a pretty good version of it too. Anyway, it's unclear from the video of Trump conducting whether the anthem you hear is Lovato projected on screens around the room or if a live performer is singing at the club. You really can't tell. The video appears flipped or mirrored likely because it is an Instagram video recorded with a phone's selfie camera. That is why Melania Trump appears to have her left hand across her chest, and there is a backward numeral 4 on the video. I'm glad that the number was shown as backwards, because otherwise people would be attacking her for having the wrong hand over the heart. The Herald chose to retain the original orientation as it was posted on the social media site. That's a good note. The White House declined to provide an on-the-record response to requests for comment. The Trump Organization did not immediately respond. Copies of the video were sent along with the Herald's inquiries. For years, Trump has publicly attacked NFL players who chose to kneel in protest during the anthem. You have to stand proudly for the national anthem, or you shouldn't be playing. You shouldn't be there. Maybe you shouldn't be in the country, Trump said in a 2018 interview with Fox and Friends. He has frequently tweeted about the issue, blaming kneeling players for a downturn in league attendance and ratings. The protest movement, as you know, started by former San Francisco 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick in August of 2016 when he refused to stand during a pre-game ritual. He described his choice as a protest against racism and police brutality. Within months, other players joined Kaepernick, taking a knee and bowing their heads during the anthem. Kaepernick, of course, no longer in the league, claiming he was blackballed for his actions. Trump and many others called the protests disrespectful to the flag and the troops. In 2018, the NFL announced it would begin to fine players for not standing. There's more on the rest of the world doing the same. Megan Rapinoe, the co-captain of the U.S. Women's World Cup team, refused to participate in the anthem during the 2019 World Cup, provoking Trump's ire, to no effect, of course. At Sunday's Super Bowl in Miami Gardens, Beyonce and Jay-Z stayed seated during the anthem, drawing rebukes from many, especially conservative pundits. Do we want to quote them? No. Here's that 2-year-old girl, Tomi Lahren, had something to say. Who cares? Super Bowl watch party at Trump International Golf Club in West Palm Beach, just miles from Mar-a-Lago, was a tradition that predates the Trump presidency. It has taken on a new price tag in recent years due to the need for presidential security and travel budgets. Taxpayers will shell out $3.4 million for Trump's visit to Palm Beach this past weekend, according to an analysis by the HuffPost. Last year's party stirred controversy when Trump inadvertently posed for a selfie with a woman who turned out to be Lee Cindy Yang, founder of the massage parlor where New England Patriots owner Robert Kraft allegedly paid for sex. Remember that story? Yeah. Well, Chinese spies all over the place. Yeah, what can you do? Just continues to happen for some reason. Oh, here's the story that I was looking for before. It was, in fact, not a South Carolina congressman, but a Kentucky congressman. The confusion, of course, the fact that he was advertising in not just Florida, but South Florida, made me think of South Carolina. Josh Dawsey was the one who had tweeted this the other day, Washington Post White House reporter, tweeting it this way: peak GOP in 2020. A Kentucky congressman is running TV ads in South Florida this weekend against his primary opponent in a bid to win over the president and convince Trump that his opponent is not worth the endorsement. The idea, of course, catches attention while he is at Mar-a-Lago. Okay, well, there. At least we now have that on the record correctly. Let's see. Other fine stories that we could bring to you today before closing things out. Let's see. What's a good way to spend our time on this? So many interesting places to look. Maybe this would be a good way to finish things up. Since we're on the impeachment, the last day of the impeachment proceedings under the current articles anyway, perhaps we can use this. This is an older article that I found when I was asking questions the other day about the Burisma accusations against Biden. By the way, not much discussion. I saw almost no discussion among media types of the question of whether or not Biden's poor performance in Iowa had anything to do with the repeated accusations against him with respect to Ukraine and Burisma and his son Hunter. And that's interesting. That's an interesting failure on the part of the Trump PR machine. But when we were asking the other day, does anybody know offhand, without looking it up, what Burisma is actually accused of doing? Well, I couldn't, so I had to look it up. And I ran into an interesting article from The Guardian from way back in April of 2017 that kind of helped clear it up. And I thought was a great backgrounder, not exactly focused on what Hunter Biden is accused of doing, but just filling in the blanks in terms of why do people walk around saying Burisma? Well, everybody knew Burisma was corrupt, or the oligarch that runs it is super corrupt. And this kind of gave us the background. So why not? We'll close things out this way. Just general information for you to keep on file should we be called upon to continue to discuss the Ukraine-focused impeachment proceedings even after today's vote. This is entitled The Money Machine, How a High-Profile Corruption Investigation Fell Apart. Remember, this is in the UK's Guardian, and it kind of has a UK focus to it. Subheader here says, after a revolution overthrew Ukraine's disgraced president, and remember this is written back in April of 2017. So I think we're talking, Poroshenko at that point? So after a revolution overthrew Ukraine's disgraced president, Theresa May, remember her, UK Prime Minister, promised to help the country's new leaders, Ukraine, recover stolen assets. But the UK's first case collapsed within a year. This by Oliver Bullough, Bullough. Hope I got that right. On March 11th, 2014. Got our time frame? A London branch of the French bank BNP Paribas received a request from a Ukrainian lawyer. He asked the bank to close accounts belonging to his client and transfer their balances to Cyprus, a bank in Cyprus. And those of you with, sharp ears will say, Cyprus, a bank in Cyprus. Was it the Bank of Cyprus? Isn't that Wilbur Ross's bank? And Cyprus keeps turning up in the middle of all sorts of things from the Mueller investigation on, and it never really, this doesn't focus on clearing up the mystery of Cyprus. It's out there, and take note. The accounts contained a mere $23 million, and the transaction should have been routine. I guess for those guys it is. But although the amount was unremarkable by the standards of the city, London, the times were not. Ukraine had just overthrown its president. Oh, this is Viktor Yanukovych. And the world was on the lookout for money that Yanukovych and his associates had stashed abroad. Yanukovych was a man whose corruption had to be seen to be believed. The colossal greed of the president and his cronies beggared the Ukrainian state and infuriated ordinary citizens. Tens of thousands of people protested in central Kyiv throughout the winter of 2013 and 14 until Yanukovych fled Ukraine that February. After the revolution, protesters who broke into his private residence found vintage cars, ostriches. How do you like that? Maybe they was making a jacket for, what's his name? Manafort. Could be, right? I mean, he was a big Manafort guy, Yanukovych. A drinking den shaped like a galleon. I don't even know what I'm talking about there. There were stacks of treasures in the garage. He had no space left for them in his $30 million, 6-story, log-built palace. What a strange contraption. Anyway, the country's new government accused its predecessors of stealing $100 billion. And the West, perhaps embarrassed that so much of this money had ended up in its banks, promised to do what it could to help return it to Ukraine. At the end of April 2014, London hosted a summit that would, in the words of then Home Secretary Theresa May, later Prime Minister, right? Here's her words. This summit would provide practical leadership and assistance to the Ukrainian government as they identify and recover assets looted under the Yanukovych regime. It is a tangible manifestation of our shared determination to end the culture of impunity. Oh well. And prevent our open societies and open economies from being abused by corrupt individuals to launder and hide stolen funds. Damn, I wish we had done that. Dozens of countries sent representatives to the summit, from the United States and the United Kingdom down to the tiniest tax havens, Bermuda, Monaco, the Isle of Man. On the summit's final afternoon, Britain's then Attorney General, Dominic Grieve, remember that name, made a dramatic announcement. The UK had already joined the fight. A transfer had been flagged as suspicious, and British authorities had frozen the account and initiated a money laundering investigation. This week, the UK's Serious Fraud Office, SFO, that's a real thing, announced that it is investigating allegations of corruption linked to the Yanukovych regime and has obtained a court order to restrain assets valued at approximately $23 million. Grieve told the assembled delegates. They did it in dollars, huh? There will be no effective deterrent for corruption whilst levels of detection of illicit financial flows and recovery of misappropriated assets remain small. If the frozen $23 million was indeed linked to corruption in Ukraine, it would still be only a fraction of what Yanukovych and his associates had been accused of embezzling. Keep that in mind, right? Because I think the big story was, oh my God, Hunter Biden got paid $1 million. Here's $23 million. And even that would only be a small fraction of what Yanukovych stole. If you're concerned about corruption in Ukraine, you're concerned about Yanukovych. But he's not. Yanukovych never comes up in any of this. Hunter Biden is the big target of this. Why doesn't Yanukovych come up? Well, one, because he doesn't care about corruption in Ukraine. And two, corruption in Ukraine and therefore Yanukovych leads you back to Paul Manafort, which is his problem. And that's why he didn't want to discuss it. Anyhow, the case, though, was intended to send a message, even though it was only this small fraction of what Yanukovych had stolen. It was supposed to send a message about the West's determination to make sure Ukraine could regain what had been stolen and that its looters be punished. This pleasingly specific number, $23 million, dominated the headlines from the summit, where it was held up as concrete proof that the rulers of the West were finally helping the rest of the world fight corruption. The message is clear, May said. We are making it harder than ever for corrupt regimes or individuals around the world to move, hide, and profit from the proceeds of their crime. For decades, hundreds of billions of dollars have vanished from the world's poorest countries, finding their way, via the tax and secrecy havens of Europe, Southeast Asia, and the Caribbean, into the banking system, real estate, and luxury goods market of the West, the traditional routes for money laundering, including, of course, everything that Donald Trump is into. Real estate and luxury goods market. According to the World Bank, between $20 billion and $40 billion is stolen each year by public officials from developing countries. Rich countries returned only $147.2 million worth of these assets between 2010 and 2012, far less than 1 cent out of every misappropriated dollar. And that may even understate the scale of the problem. Some lawyers involved in asset recovery cases estimate the volume of money embezzled globally at around $1 trillion a year, which makes the tiny amount of money recovered look even feebler. Compare 1 million to that. Or even 50,000 a month to that. As both a financial center that launders an estimated 100 billion pounds a year and a prime real estate market for the investors of crooked cash, London has a special responsibility in the fight against corruption, one that it has rarely accepted. In the 2014 summit, much like David Cameron's highly publicized Global Anti-Corruption Summit in 2016, was intended to show Britain's determination to live up to its responsibilities. Instead, the case of the $23 million collapsed within a year when a British judge ruled that the SFO had built the case on, quote, conjecture and suspicion, unquote, and ordered the money returned to its, I guess here it should say, quote, owner. This is the story of how a very high-profile corruption investigation fell apart and what it means for Ukraine and the UK. Yanukovych was not the first Ukrainian politician to engage in corruption, but he was certainly the best at it. In fact, the word corruption is a misleading one for Ukraine since it implies a dishonest cancer afflicting an otherwise healthy organism, whereas in this case it was the other way around. Corruption was the system, and it metastasized into any parts of the state apparatus that remained healthy. In the 3 years after Yanukovych took office in 2010, Ukraine slipped from an already disastrous 134th on Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index down to 144th, putting it level with countries such as the Central African Republic and Nigeria, which are synonymous with shadiness and mismanagement. Sorry, guys. But the financial damage that Yanukovych and his predecessors did in Ukraine is hard to measure in simple numbers. At the time of its independence in 1991, Ukraine's economy was almost as large as Poland's. Now it is a third of the size. Yanukovych and his allies controlled the country's legal system, within which prosecutors have broad discretionary powers to initiate or block investigations, providing unlimited opportunities for extortion. They could deny export licenses, delay tax rebates, inflate medicine prices, and demand bribes in return. To outside observers, it seemed that the only opposition came from investigative journalists and activists who revealed the backroom deals that had carved up Ukraine's economy. To frustrate any potential investigations, Ukraine's rulers became masters of the offshore world's networks of tax havens. Once money was stolen, it was invested in European and American assets hidden at the end of intricate chains of shell companies registered through tax havens in the Indian Ocean, Europe, and the Caribbean, sometimes known as the Caribbean. It is Cyprus rather than Russia. Cyprus, again, get this. Cyprus rather than Russia, Germany, or America that dominates the Ukrainian economy. An astonishing 92% of Ukraine's outward investment, if it can even be called investment, flowed into the Mediterranean tax haven in 2014. 92% of the money leaving Ukraine and going to somewhere else in the world went to Cyprus. Not Russia to buy natural gas, not Germany or America to buy goods of any sort. Cyprus to sit in the bank. The secrecy of these offshore centers allowed the oligarchs around Yanukovych to keep the precise details of their deals hidden from the public, but ordinary Ukrainians knew enough to be angry. If Ukraine's 2014 revolution was about any one thing, it was about this corruption. Yanukovych and his allies had stolen as much as they could, more than they could ever need. And even the most apolitical citizens could see that infrastructure was rotting, medicines were scarce, schools were falling apart. The armed forces were so demoralized by the degeneration of the homeland they were supposed to defend that when Vladimir Putin invaded Crimea, a Ukrainian admiral defected as soon as Russia asked him to. The UK government trumpeted the freezing of the $23 million for two reasons. First, it was meant to be the initial installment of many billions that would eventually help rebuild Ukraine. If that sum could be confiscated in return, perhaps so too could the hundreds of millions stashed in London, Latvia, Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, and elsewhere. Second, the successful prosecution of a regime insider would send a message to the world's kleptocrats: your money isn't safe in London anymore. The $23 million was held in bank accounts at BNP Paribas, belonging to two companies, which were in turn controlled by a Ukrainian politician named Mykola Zlochevsky. Now, that might be familiar to you, but if we don't get to it, that's the guy from Burisma. That's the corrupt oligarch. So here's who we're talking about here. A large man with a shaved head, Zlochevsky wears boxy suits, dislikes fastening the top button of his shirt, and has been a fixture of Ukraine's public life for 2 decades. In 2013, according to the Ukrainian news weekly Focus, which almost certainly understated his fortune, he was Ukraine's 86th richest man and worth $146 million. That's actually important to note, because as much of this story as it revolves around him, he's the 86th richest man. I'd love to be the 86th richest man, of course, but What that means, of course, is there's 85 people who are stealing more money than he is. And one of the people that he may or may not be paying through his company is getting $50,000 a month. And they're focusing on that guy. Just putting that out there. In 2010, after Yanukovych won the election, Zlochevsky became Natural Resources Minister. That position gave him oversight of all energy companies operating in Ukraine, including the country's largest independent gas company, Burisma. The potential for a conflict of interest should have been clear because Zlochevsky himself controlled Burisma. But there was no public outcry about this because almost no one in Ukraine knew about it. Zlochevsky owned his business via Cyprus. All his businesses via Cyprus, a favored haven for assets unobtrusively controlled by high-ranking officials of the Yanukovych administration. In response to my questions about the freezing of Zlochevsky's $23 million, his London law firm, Peters & Peters, insisted that their client never benefited personally from the decisions that he took while in office. Mr. Zlochevsky has followed the letter and spirit of the law in his role as civil servant and has at all times held himself to the highest moral and ethical standards in his business dealings and public functions. Peters & Peters said in a statement, "Our clients have fallen victim to an entrenched and a cynical program of smear campaigns and misinformation." A common claim. Mr. Zlochevsky's wealth is not a result of corruption or criminal conduct, the law firm told me. He made his wealth before entering office. It is true that Zlochevsky was a wealthy man before 2010. Burisma's website makes clear that the periods when it has performed best have consistently coincided with the high points in its owner's political career. During a previous Yanukovych government in 2003 to 2005, Zlochevsky chaired the State Committee for Natural Resources, and companies under his control won licenses to explore for oil. Then Yanukovych fell from grace, and the new government tried to strip Zlochevsky's companies of their oil exploration rights, and he had to sue the government in order to keep them. Yanukovych won the presidency in 2010, and Zlochevsky became a minister. The good times returned. Burisma gained 9 production licenses, and its annual production rose 7-fold. After the revolution, Zlochevsky left the administration. In fact, he left the country, right? According to a court judgment from January 2015, the $23 million in the account that had been frozen in London was the proceeds of the sale of an oil storage facility which Zlochevsky had owned via a shell company in the British Virgin Islands, a tax haven that does not reveal who controls the many thousands of companies based there. The $23 million arrived in London from Latvia, a minimally regulated Eastern European country where banks are famously welcoming towards money from the former Soviet Union. On April 14, 2014, the money was frozen at a special court hearing in London requested by the Serious Fraud Office. As described in the later court judgment, the SFO argued that there was reasonable grounds to believe that the defendant, Zlochevsky, had engaged in criminal conduct in Ukraine, and the funds in the BNP account were believed to be the proceeds of such criminal conduct. The SFO investigator, Richard Gould, claimed in the April 2014 court hearing that Zlochevsky's dual position in Ukraine as both politician and businessman gave rise to a clear inference of a willful and dishonest exploitation of a direct conflict of interest by a man holding an important public office, such as to amount to an abuse of the public's trust in him. Does sound familiar, doesn't it? The SFO further argued that the complicated pattern of offshore holding companies established when he was still serving as minister was effectively to conceal his beneficial ownership of Burisma, which it deemed inherently suspicious. Well, by May 20th, 2014, Gould had obtained 6,170 electronic documents from BNP related to Zlochevsky's money and assembled a special team to examine them. He also wanted evidence from Ukraine. So he wrote to the head of the International Department of the General Prosecutor's Office, at that point, Vitaly Kasko, in Kiev. It is starting to sound familiar, isn't it? Well, there's a lot more to it. It's a very long read, and we can't get to the rest of it today. But I thought I would start you off on this And we may continue with the discussion of it, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps Friday. But if we don't, I highly recommend that you take a look at this. It does explain a lot about why Zlochevsky and Burisma were suspected of corruption. But it makes no mention whatsoever, of course, of Hunter Biden. And it's not meant to. But it does illustrate the difficulty that the West was having in pursuing these cases, and does get around to mentioning and discussing, I think at some length, the efforts of the United States in this. But this is done from the UK's perspective, but there are all sorts of Western governments. This is what it's really great at, is explaining the background of how the entire rest of the world united to try, at first, to try and recover some of what Yanukovych and his pals had stolen from Ukraine, and how they ended up getting thwarted, not only by prosecutors in Ukraine, but by courts that were dependent on the evidence that those guys in the prosecutor's office in Ukraine refused to turn over. It is an enormous problem, but it explains very well why Viktor Shokin had to go.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
All right, well, so there may be nothing new to the story that Viktor Shokin had to go, and you may have known the general reasons why, but there's some great detail there. We'll perhaps dive into it later on. For now, though, time for Justice Putnam to return to the airwaves with his show. I did manage to get back on yesterday, I believe. Anyway, anything we may have missed today, whether home or around the world, comes up next. Stay tuned.